Welcome to the webinar Human Trafficking in 2024, Trends and Patterns, organized by the Orion Policy Institute, OPI. OPI is an independent nonprofit think tank based in Washington, D.C., and has been bringing scholars and practitioners together to address national and global security concerns. OPI has dedicated significant efforts to examining the evolving security threats, including human trafficking, and developing effective policy solutions. As we approach the conclusion of the Human Trafficking Prevention Month, OPI has brought together this distinguished panel of experts to discuss some of the expected trends and patterns within the human trafficking landscape throughout this year that just started. My name is Marta Furlan. I am a non-resident research fellow at Orion Policy Institute and research officer at Free the Slaves. I was given the honor to moderate today's webinar. Today with me in this webinar are George Hancock, project officer at Humanity Research Consultancy. In his presentation, George will focus on some of the areas of expertise of HRC, modern slavery and labor rights abuses on fishing vessels, fraud factories in Southeast Asia, and survivor engagement. Then we have Shilian Ifiazu, founder of Female Returned Migrants Network. She will discuss trends and patterns of human trafficking in Nigeria, challenges and opportunities to combat human trafficking in the country, and the role of survivor leaders in the fight against human trafficking. Then we have Suti Sutirtha Saharia, who is an independent researcher. He will discuss the crucial role of survivor engagement. He will guide us through a case study to demonstrate that it is the survivor's rehabilitation journey that informs policy and programs rather than his or his trafficking journey. And then Catherine Fougère-Masters, research fellow at the University of Nottingham. She will talk about her research on the viability of voluntary repatriation as an alternative or addition to rescue for Nepali women who are in situations of commercial sexual exploitation in India. Before we dive into our webinar, some logistical comments. Each speaker will give a 10 minutes overview of what they believe will be the main human trafficking trends to pay close attention to this year. Their intervention will be then followed by a Q&A session. And to the members of the audience, if you have any question, please do write it in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen, and we will address it after the presentations. Now, before I turn to our members of the panel, allow me to start the discussion by sharing some of my perspective on human trafficking's trends and patterns in 2024. Specifically, the topic that I would like to briefly discuss is the intersection between climate change and human trafficking, a topic to which Free the Slaves we have been given significant attention over the past year. Okay. So, why climate change and human trafficking? Vulnerability to human trafficking is determined by various social, economic, political, and cultural factors. To mention a few, we have conflicts, food and water insecurity, human rights violation, harmful cultural norms and practices, and so on. However, it is increasingly recognized that climate change also intersects with the reality of human trafficking in different ways. To explore some of the ways in which these intersections play out, we did research in 3 localities: in the Amazonian region of Peru, in East Africa, and in the Philippines. What did we find in each of these places? In the Amazonian region of Peru, we found that illegal activities of resource extraction, specifically gold mining and logging, typically rely on forced labor because of their illicit nature. These activities contribute dramatically to environmental degradation and exacerbate the effects of climate change that are already very much felt in the Amazonian forest. In a context of environmental degradation, the indigenous communities who live in these territories lose their traditional livelihood, which is typically forestry and agriculture, and they find themselves in conditions of poverty. This poverty ultimately exposes them to the risk of exploitation, and many indigenous youth, especially men and young men and boys, end up in forced labor in illegal mining sites, So what we observed is a dramatic and perpetual self-sustaining cycle of vulnerability, whereby indigenous youth end up working in situations of exploitation in the same industries that are depleting the natural resources on which their community depends. Besides, we also observed cases of child marriage and sexual exploitation among indigenous communities adversely affected by these illegal extractivist activities and by environmental degradation. Another aspect that was very interesting to notice is that the traditional neglect that indigenous communities have been historically facing in the Peruvian state since the Spanish Empire, since the colonial time, has been adding up to this situation of vulnerability. Then turning to East Africa, we identified that repeated cycles of drought, in Ethiopia especially, have left thousands of people without their traditional means of sustenance, specifically as they lost their cattle. In an environment that suddenly became inhospitable, communities and households often saw themselves forced to leave their lands and to look for better opportunities elsewhere. Many, especially young people, who most often get sponsored by their whole family, extended family, and even their original village, in order to make the trip abroad and hopefully send remittances back home, embark on a dangerous journey through the Gulf of Aden to reach the Arabian Peninsula through Yemen, and then in the Gulf monarchy, hopefully find a job. Along this illegal journey, illegal because it takes place beyond what is legally allowed by the Ethiopian state and by the Saudi Arabian state, which is the destination country, and is a journey mediated by a network of migrant smugglers and human trafficking. They are vulnerable to multiple forms of exploitation. Specifically, we found instances of forced labor, sex trafficking, domestic servitude, and forced begging among children. This exposure to the risk of trafficking is observed at 3 distinct moments along the journey. When they transit through Djibouti and Somalia before making the crossing through the Gulf of Aden, when transiting through Yemen upon disembarking in the Arabian Peninsula, and finally when arriving at their destination, which is most often Saudi Arabia. Finally, in the Philippines, we found that climate change-related rapid onset events, typically typhoons, create and exacerbate conditions of vulnerability that expose individuals to the risk of being exploited into different forms of human trafficking. This occurs when communities have a limited capacity, both in terms of resources, but also in terms of know-how, to prepare for a climate adverse event, and when they have limited capacity as well to recover from those events. Human traffickers in these situations are well positioned to exploit these vulnerabilities for their own material and personal benefit. However, it is not only the human traffickers. Families also, because they are negatively affected by climate change events, they are more prone to resort to negative coping strategies, most commonly child labor, but something dramatic that we identified was also the tendency among family to rely to the online sexual exploitation of children because of a misplaced perception that this is not a crime because it happens online and not in the physical world. So in conclusion, recognizing that climate change, natural hazards increase the vulnerability of individuals and communities to exploitation, it emerges that actions that address climate change-related vulnerabilities become a needed strategy to end the conditions that allow modern slavery and human trafficking to exist and to be perpetuated. Now, after this introduction, I will leave the floor to George for his remarks.
All right, thank you. Am I able to share my screen?
Yes, George, you should be able.
Okay. Can you let me know if you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, thanks for that, Marta. That was a great introduction, and I have a few questions that I'll hopefully bring up in the Q&A. But yeah, I'd like to thank my other panelists today and the attendees and the Orion Institute and Marta for hosting this webinar. Today, I'll actually be talking about the trends and patterns of human trafficking that we foresee in 2024, but I'll actually be focusing on the case of forced criminality in the scamming compounds. So I'm George Hancock, Project Officer at HRC. So, HRC, Humanity Research Consultancy, we are a social enterprise. We work with key stakeholders, local consultants, and survivor networks to combat modern slavery and human trafficking from around the world. We believe a collaborative approach is essential towards tackling this problem. So at HRC, we do work on a wide range of human trafficking issues, but one in particular that I'll focus on today is something that we've been at the forefront of investigating and reporting on. We've also assisted over 70 survivors from these compounds. So scamming compounds. Some of you may have heard of them. They're also referred to as fraud factories or scam farms. No matter what you call them, these terms don't capture the modern slavery conditions that exist in them. So they're locations where victims of human trafficking are forced to defraud people online. This is often done through romance scams, where trafficked victims develop online relationships with people from around the world and deceive them into investing in cryptocurrency schemes. Now, these schemes are sophisticated, and the scammed victims suffer immense economic and psychological damage. In 2023, losses connected to the romance scams amounted to almost $3 billion in America alone. Now, it's important to remember that the scammer on the other side of the screen is actually a trafficked victim, a victim of forced criminality. This crime is a double-edged sword with two victims, the scam victim and the traffic victim. When HRC first reported on this issue in 2022, it was estimated that there were tens of thousands of victims in these compounds. However, in 2023, the UN estimated that there are actually hundreds of thousands, with 120,000 in Myanmar alone. These victims come from all over the world. Initially, victims came from Southeast Asia, but now victims are coming from Europe, America, and Africa. HRC has identified victims from over 20 nationalities, and the UN over 40. These victims are lured in by false job opportunities online, and unlike other forms of trafficking, these victims are often well-educated, tech-savvy, and can speak multiple languages. They're deceived into thinking they'll be working in marketing or IT jobs, only for their passports to be confiscated and brought to compounds where they are told they must defraud people. So a colleague of mine at HRC, who's actually a survivor of these compounds, has described them as hell. From his testimony and countless others, the trafficking in these compounds is clear. Victims must work 16-hour days. If they don't perform their crimes efficiently, they suffer from physical, sexual, and psychological violence. They're often sold between their compounds and held in debt bondage, which means they must work to repay their debts. They're not able to escape as the compounds are guarded in areas where they are vulnerable and have little opportunity to find help. On the screen here, you can see an example of one of the compounds and just the growth. In 2020, there's basically nothing there. And in 2023, there's almost a small city of these trafficking compounds with thousands of victims here. So these compounds primarily exist in Southeast Asia, in the Mekong region. They're often found within special economic zones in areas with poor governance and powerful transnational organized crime groups. The situation is particularly problematic in the Golden Triangle, an area which connects Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand. There's a particularly high amount of these compounds in SEZs. There's a particularly high amount of SEZs in this area with strong ties to drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and other criminal activities. The SEZs and the compounds in them also have links to business and political elites, and in some cases, such as Myanmar, the military. Now, it's important to emphasize that there are billions of dollars in this specific type of human trafficking. According to the UNODC, just one country in the region is estimated to have earned between 7.5 and 12.5 billion US dollars last year from the scamming compounds alone. This amount of money means that those profiting will not want to lose their lucrative revenue stream. We're also seeing that these compounds are spreading and being built at a rapid rate far beyond the Southeast Asian region to places such as Peru, Dubai, Georgia, Morocco, and even West Africa. Interpol has issued an orange notice on this trend, which means that this form of trafficking threatens the security of almost every country around the world. This crime is growing. So, from that, we can see some trends for trafficking in general in 2024. A trend that we will continue seeing is the move towards forced criminality, rather than forced marriages or traditional forms of forced labor in certain areas. For example, we've detected a significant rise in the number of forced criminality victims coming from Vietnam. There's also a changing of the traditional roles of trafficking origin country and destination country. In the past, Cambodia was an origin country for victims, with Cambodians being trafficked to other countries nearby. Now it's a destination country, with victims from around the world coming to scamming compounds in Cambodia itself. And unlike previous forms of human trafficking, we see a trend where criminal nationalities do not match the destination of origin countries. So for example, Chinese criminals are operating compounds in Myanmar, with trafficked victims coming from all around the world. So this crime, or trafficking in general, in 2024, we see the rise of technology being used. For example, in the case of the trafficking compounds, the criminals are using social media for recruiting trafficking victims and using cryptocurrencies to scam victims and launder their money. Criminals are utilizing the cutting edge of technology for these crimes. Again, in the case of scamming compounds, we've seen their use of AI software for translation purposes and deep fakes to trick their victims. The criminals' ability to recruit and scam people are also highly adaptive. For example, we have seen the rise of a new type of scam in the compounds, where the victims must complete routine tasks to get easy money, only to be defrauded. Finally, we have economic uncertainty, which leads to individuals taking precarious decisions. People are more likely to take risky job opportunities in known trafficking destination countries when there's limited job opportunities in their home country. It appears that economic uncertainty will continue in many at-risk regions for human trafficking in 2024. I'd like to briefly discuss some positive trends that some responses rather that we'll see in the trafficking compounds in 2024. First of all, the awareness of this problem is increasing and will continue to do so this year. Now, some of you have already heard of these trafficking compounds, which is a sign of this because that's not been the case for a while now. So there's been reporting in the BBC, CNN, Times Magazine, and the general public is more aware. There's also been increased efforts by foreign governments. For example, when embassies of trafficked victims pressure local authorities and demand the release of their citizens, we've seen that they have been successful in rescuing them. The role of sanctions can also increase in 2024. The United States, UK, and European Union nations have the power to pressure local governments to take action. HRC actually published a briefing on utilizing sanctions as a tool by governments. The UK government issued a new set of sanctions against criminals associated with the compounds shortly after we published this. We also have exercises such as Interpol's Operation Stormmakers 2, which mobilized law enforcement in 27 countries across Asia to target the scamming compounds. Here we have an example of the UK's recent sanctions last year, and we're hoping for more of this in the year to come. So following on from that, we have the incorporation of technology by law enforcement, which is an encouraging trend. For example, there's been a greater push towards the use of open source intelligence in combating these criminals. Open source intelligence is the gathering and analyzing of publicly available information. As the criminals in this form of human trafficking rely on social media to recruit people and to communicate with each other, open source intelligence provides law enforcement with the ability to prosecute individuals and learn more about the criminal tactics in order to better disrupt their capabilities. International organizations such as UNODC have conducted open source workshops and trained law enforcement to counter this form of human trafficking. And we see this this will continue in the year to come. HRC has also published a mini dictionary late last year, which provided insight into the key words that criminals and the scamming compounds use online. This can be used to investigate cases of trafficking alongside open source intelligence. Finally, there's also been a move towards tracing cryptocurrency transactions. Criminals of this form and other forms of human trafficking often use crypto to launder their money. In part, this is believed because they believe it's untraceable, but this is not true. We can expect more headlines, such as the one in this slide, as the authorities catch up in their abilities to trace cryptocurrencies and tie them to the criminals of the scamming compounds. On a final note, there are some barriers. I know I posed some opportunities there, but the reality of the situation is that there are quite a few barriers that will curtail the success of these responses. The cross-border nature of these crimes is difficult for prosecutions. There's language barriers, there's the digital nature of this crime, and jurisdictional difficulties. Government attitudes will also present challenges going forward. Trafficked victims are coming from countries where their governments have done little to help their citizens abroad. These governments may refuse to acknowledge the presence of their citizens in these compounds or even the crime itself. In some cases, they don't have representatives in the countries with the compounds. Ethiopia, for example, does not have an embassy in Myanmar. Local authorities and Border Patrol also tend to treat victims as criminals. They can be locked up, fined, and held in detention centers. This violates the non-punishment principle a UN principle which aims to prevent the prosecution of trafficking victims in forced criminality. So there's still scope for this crime to continue growing, as there's so much money at stake, people are desperate for jobs, and these criminals are highly organized. In 2024, hopefully the counter-trafficking community can come together and find innovative solutions to tackle this crime. Thank you very much. I'm George Hancock, as I've said, with HRC, and you can find some of our details below. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, George. This was super interesting. Thank you for sharing with us all the work that Humanity Research Consultancy has been doing on this crucial topic. And I will now invite Shilian to take the floor and share with us about human trafficking from a Nigerian perspective. Shilian, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Orion. I don't know if I'm getting that right for this opportunity to be here. Thank you so much, Mata. Human trafficking trends in 2024 in Nigeria. Basically, there are certain trends that the organizations and the government has paid attention to, but there is a little shifting in 2024. We've seen the shift between 2023 and is really increasing in 2024. The first one I'd like to talk about is familial trafficking. The reason why this is a major concern for me is because of the fact that a lot of persons do not pay attention to it. So many of the trafficked victims were trafficked within their family context, and the situation increased because it's something that happens within family. I mean, we have cultural issues here. When anything happens within family, you don't talk about it, you don't argue with family, you don't do anything about it. Because of that, this is a major concern. It is something that needs to be given huge attention. The second one is internal trafficking. Because the government and the agencies are paying attention to external trafficking, there is a high rate of internal trafficking going on, and these victims are used for domestic servitude, baby factories. We've discovered that there are a lot of baby factories recently within Nigeria, and then majority of them are used for forced prostitution. We've also found out that there is a huge use of the social media right now to recruit victims. So because everyone is on the social media platforms, everyone is desperate. A lot of people want to get better life. You are working really hard on social media, and so these traffickers have started using social media mostly for their recruiting. So they hardly go into the places where we used to know them to get their victims from, but now they use the social media platforms to get their victims. Traffickers and victims and smugglers are stemming from people who have been victimized before. This is a major concern for me. I have a belief that hurt people tend to hurt others. And so traffickers are people who've experienced it, who didn't have adequate orientation, who've not been educated, who've not been informed about how this is a crime. People who have, already experienced this pain and also want to inflict this pain on others. As a survivor, I understand this principle, and that's the reason why it's a major concern for me. And I know that so many of the traffickers right now are victims of trafficking who have also been re-victimized. So they are still under the cartel and still working with their traffickers, can't get away, and are used to recruit others. And also the final trend in 2024 that we are seeing and would increase is the fact that the trafficking routes we used to know and we used to work towards guiding, safeguarding the borders and making sure that it doesn't continue has changed. The regions where we've talked about over time, since about my trafficking experience happened in 2017, and since 2017 till date, I've seen a lot of conversation about these environments where these traffickers operate and where they take these victims to. It's no longer as loud as it is. And so these traffickers have changed their routes. they understand that there is a lot of awareness about these environments, and so they are going to environments where there is less conversation, where there is less awareness about, and so it needs to be paid huge attention. It is still happening within Africa. They are still taking people within from Nigeria to Europe and to the Middle East, but not to the countries where we've always talked about, oh yes, trafficking is happening in Libya, but not, they are no longer focusing their attention in those places where we've been talking about. So I think there is need for us to increase our awareness about these places. The key challenges in combating human trafficking in Nigeria right now, I'll talk about corruption as the first one. Corruption is a huge problem in this region, and you find out that most of these traffickers are working with people in the sector, people within, even within the anti-trafficking sector, people within, people who are in the agencies that were supposed to protect victims. These are the people they work with to keep their business going. The second one is limited resources. I mean, there is limited resources to fight trafficking. Agencies are paying attention to other challenges in the world and pay less attention to human trafficking. So because there's limited resources to fight human trafficking, you see a wide range of trafficking going on. Lack of awareness and understanding. I believe that right now, we've come to believe that there is awareness of trafficking, and so a lot of people are relaxing. People are not giving the huge talk about human trafficking as they're supposed to, and so even within the anti-trafficking sector, so many people are unaware of what trafficking really is, and they question victims. They make victims speak less when they are supposed to even speak more about what has happened to them. So I think a lack of awareness and understanding of what trafficking really is a challenge. And then we have very weak legal frameworks, and some of the policies that have come up, they are not being implemented. And so this is also a problem. We have social and cultural factors. We have huge demand for exploitative services. This is something that Nigerians don't talk about, but it's a problem. There is, before you have supply, there should be demand, right? And so we are not researching on what this demand is, what is really propelling trafficking, what is really causing trafficking. Why is there no agency talking about the demand for sex workers in different places, and the reason why these traffickers are desperate to get their victims? We really need to look into this demand and curb it. And then I believe that in this region, there is lack of data and research. We hardly pay attention to research. And then vulnerability of migrants and refugees. Most of the victims of trafficking come from internal displaced camps. So most of the victims are internally displaced persons, and we need to pay attention to internally displaced persons, take care of them to ensure that they don't fall victim to human trafficking. Some of the policies that I have seen that has worked within Nigeria so far is policies that criminalize certain human trafficking forms, and also that penalizes traffickers. Some, not all, because there's just a wide range of policies here and there, but then there is limited implementation of these policies. And then I've seen that there is also strong strengthening of the borders. There is recently the agencies that are involved in border control, they are really working hard to ensure that these borders are not as porous as they used to. And I can attest to the fact that it's not as porous as it used to. When I traveled in 2017, the border was porous. Nobody checked my documents, so it was easy. But right now, there is serious check going on. So these policies are actually working at the moment. What we've seen happening that has really helped: community engagement, victim support. There are agencies that have also tried to ensure that communities are supported and engaged with to ensure that trafficked victims are given adequate support. Law enforcement has been strengthened, and there is cross-sector partnership happening. So that's really something to applaud within this system. And there's shelter and safe houses. When I came back in 2017, I was made to go back to where my trafficking experience happened. But now, because of the involvement of survivors, there is safe houses, there are psychosocial support programs going on, there is skills training and empowerment for survivors who are returning, there is awareness, and there are prevention campaigns happening all over Nigeria, and that's really encouraging. There are legal assistance, but I think there is a need to talk more about those legal assistance, because most of these traffic victims do not really know what this assistance is. There is long-term support. We've always spoken about it as survivors, and I can see that there are organizations that are really paying attention to what we've said and what we've cried about, what we've complained about that we really need to see, and those things have increased so far. Talking about the role of survival leaders in the fight against human trafficking, I want to talk about what we've done so far, what we as survival leaders have tried to do within this region. Survival leaders have paid so much attention to awareness raising, and that is really encouraging for me, because I feel like a lot of survival leaders have come up to say, oh, this is what happened to me, especially using the same medium that traffickers are using to get their victim, for instance, the social media. This is really important to me. I see survival leaders rising, having huge platforms to speak and tell their stories, tell their experiences, regardless of how they are being treated or judged. This is important. Policy advocacy, peer mentorship, and counseling. This is something that I've seen in the past couple of months happening. I would say within the last 1 year, a lot of survival leaders have risen to give the same support to other survivors. And some who are doing very okay, I would say. I got some of the trainings from other survival leaders, and this is really encouraging. My call to action would be, first, that there is a need to strengthen the penalties. So in Nigeria, you find out that a trafficker will take their victims and work with them for over 2 years, make over 3 million naira from these victims, and the government and the legislature or the law enforcement will just charge them probably 100,000 or 1 year in prison. And before 6 months, you find out that this same trafficker is already out. I think there is a need for the government to start strengthening penalties. The penalties are not enough, and it's really increasing the audacity of traffickers. I feel like this is something that they need to listen to survivors about. I would not be exploited for 3 years and alongside other victims in the same environment with the same trafficker who would have made over 20 million naira, and you charge the person less than 1% of what I've seen the person make over time. And this has also made survivors uncomfortable and unsafe, because a trafficker who is charged, a survivor comes to speak up in the court about their experiences, and then eventually these traffickers are given less penalties. These things need to be taken care of. Again, another call to action would be adequate protection for victims. There is no protection for victims. Victims who are ready to speak up about what their experiences were are not really protected by the agencies that should protect them. So you push them to speak or tell their experiences, and also speak in law courts about what happened to them, and for them to penalize their traffickers. And at the end of the day, they are not given the protection they deserve. Also, I think there is need for us to strengthen the border controls, increase the border controls. I know that there's efforts going on, but more needs to be done, because traffickers are finding new routes. It's still within Nigeria. I don't know if they are the ones creating those routes, but then something needs to be done to close those borders. There should be meaningful engagements with survivor leaders. I've heard agencies say, use survivor leaders to bridge the gap. Don't use survivor leaders. Involve and engage, include and engage survivor leaders. You don't use them to do whatsoever you wish. So you create a particular project. You don't try to fit survivor leaders into the project, and then you just pick probably one person to I don't know how to put this, but then you make it look like there's survivor engagement and involvement in the project. Meanwhile, there's nobody who's speaking up for survivors in your project. So I think there is need for meaningful engagement. I would also call that there should be funding for survivor-led organizations that have seen it, that understand what it's like, that know the root causes, that have experienced it, needs to be funded to help in solving human trafficking. Include survivor leaders in policy development, include survivor leaders in capacity enhancement, and also recognize and support survivors. I'll say that generally, the rise of human trafficking would be stopped if survivor leaders are included and meaningfully engaged in 2024. A lot would change because we've seen a lot of progress in the past years because of survivor leaders, and we need to continue. Thank you so much, and I hope I didn't exceed my time.
Thank you so much, Shillian. This was a super interesting overview of the trafficking landscape in Nigeria, including what is going better and what needs to be improved further. I will now invite Suti to take the floor.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, OPI and Martha, for inviting me to this webinar this evening. And I'm really pleased to be a part of this esteemed group of speakers. Now, I'll be talking to you more from the prevention and policy perspective. Now, I have been working on the human trafficking field for over 12 years now, or first 7-8 years as a journalist reporting for various international media. Before getting into research. Now, over the last few years, there has been a lot of interest on modern slavery, and academics, policymakers, everyone is talking about it, and there's a new kind of funding and research that's happening. But most of these research ideas are conceived in the global north. And the question is, does it really help when it actually comes down to helping people on the ground? So in 2022, funded by the Modern Slavery Human Rights and Policy Center and hosted by the University of Liverpool, there was this concept of engaging, how does engagement of survivors in policy and programs look like? Now, this is quite a big thing, in engagement of survivors in policy and programs. It's in English. So I did a kind of a rapid a study in India, Nepal, and Bangladesh to really understand, do people actually understand these terms? People who are actually on the ground, the frontline organization. The answer was not really. I mean, they really didn't understand because the terminology is so huge. But then last year, I went to the ground in a very frontline organization, and that organization sits on the India-Bangladesh border, very vulnerable to climate change, and there are cyclones every now and then. Poverty is rampant, the border is porous, and the local media, the national media in India says that around 2,000 to 3,000 women and girls are trafficked from that area every single year. So I kind of did a scoping work and found a frontline organization. Now, frontline organizations are organizations that are working right in the source area, which is a source of human trafficking. And the study was important because, to understand the contextual challenges and the possibilities of engaging survivors in human trafficking policies, and also to understand the knowledge gap between national and international best practices and the local experiences of the local grassroots organizations. So what did we find? One of the things that I found was that it is survivors, rehabilitation journey that actually informs policies and programs, not necessarily the trafficking journey. Every survivor has a story which they would not like to talk about, how they were trafficked. Now, that's extremely important for criminal investigation and so on. But it is actually the traffickers' rehabilitation journey, because when a survivor comes back home or she's rescued, she has to face enormous level of stigma and discrimination in the society, and sometimes she's not accepted by her own parents. But remember that these are very poor people, not very educated. But when I went to the field, I realized that the frontline organization was using a very important tool. It's called Survivors Intake tool. There are 10 to 12 dimensions here. So what they do is that when a survivor comes back home, they kind of analyze what her needs are, basic needs of house, food, shelter. Do they have it or not? Physical and development needs. Sometimes she lands up in very difficult places. Sometimes she's, goes through rape and, other kinds of physical violence. How is she coping with that? And then emotional and mental health, the level of trauma that she goes through is massive. Her self-esteem is all-time low. She's also very young and she doesn't really know how to cope with how to kind of deal with the situation. Sometimes many of the survivors that I have come across are school dropouts. They drop out of school and suddenly when they come back, the education institution they're affiliated with are not interested in taking them back. But then the community-based organization has to play a role to convince them to take them back. Some survivors were adults. The big problem is the livelihood, work and income. That's one of the biggest requirements of the survivors. Family relationships is one, because most families do not want to take them back. Even if they take them back, they want to marry off the girl because of the social honor or the dishonor that she might have brought onto the family. Social relationships, recreational needs, because like all of us is a human being and she has recreational needs. Legal aid and support, the justice, how to lodge a complaint with the police and how to find an FIR. These are basically, when a survivor comes back home, there are 10 to 12 programs that needs to be activated parallelly. And this is a part of our rehabilitation program, and normally this is how the star of well-being based on what I just showed. Like, for example, if a survivors, they kind of grade themselves, where do they stand in terms of this is in the local language, Bengali language, but for example, if the basic needs, one of the survivors graded herself as 2, and then physical and development needs, she scored herself 3. But this is how the star of well-being looks like. The bigger the circle means you are on the path of rehabilitation. The smaller the circle, there's a long, long way to go. But how do actually survivors engage in policy and programs? And in India and the South Asian region, this is how it looks like. Like if you are a survivor, and if you're working with a community-based organization, the thing is that when you need food, housing, or health needs, you reach out to, there are 4 levels of governance in India and Bangladesh and Nepal. Like, for example, if you need housing, you have to reach out to the block development office, which is at the village level. Now, this process, the fact that housing facilities are available is something most people would not know. But because you're a survivor, with the help of community-based organization, you start demanding your rights, your food, your housing and health. And in the process, you learn how to kind of work with the policies that translate into schemes. Like if I'm a survivor, and if I need a house, the CBO would direct me how to actually file an application and how to apply for housing. Now that is a very vital need. Similarly, in terms of policies, like if I'm a survivor, I would not know how to go to a police station and file a report, or how do I get victim compensation. These are very torturous and cumbersome process. But with the help of a community-based organization, the survivor for the first time from being a normal, ordinary person, once she is back, she is forced, or if she wants to, she can actually go and ask for victim compensation or even file a police complaint against the trafficker. But this whole experience of survivor interaction with the policy kind of builds the self-esteem of the survivor. She also gains a lot of knowledge in the process because you're learning, It's kind of like when you go to a foreign country, you sometimes have to apply for a visa, but because you have gone through the process of applying for a visa, you learn the process and you're in a position to help some other survivor, some other person, in this case, some other survivors. And this is how actually engagement with policy and programs takes place. Now, here, this is quite a complex diagram, but what I'm explaining to you, the report is now available online. It's on the Human Rights Policy and Research Center website. It just published last week. So this is here when a survivor comes back, the community-based organization kind of engages in the secondary level of engagement. They work with survivors here. But when survivors goes through this process, when they join a survivors leaders group, they come back to the community and they do awareness program. That's a secondary level, primary prevention measures. And then you have survivor self-help group, and this is on the right, you have NRLM and bank and all those things. Some of the survivors, they create self-help groups for the livelihood programs. And this is where they start interacting with banks and the government livelihood schemes. But this is quite a process, which is a cumbersome process, and it's a process in which they learn a lot, but it takes quite a time. And this diagram is a bit difficult to explain, but as I said, if you read the report, it'll be much more clear. One more thing that we discovered on the ground is that the use of the terms, most survivors would not like to be called as survivors in this part of the world. They say that we are right holders, not survivors, because our rights as citizens were violated at the first place. The state or the community could not protect us. But when you come back, when you start demanding your rights, a right to live, a right to food, a right to shelter, this is something every citizen is guaranteed under the Constitution of India here. So they like to be called as right holders, really. But having shown this, this is quite a brief presentation. One thing that I would like to bring to the notice of everyone, especially when you talk about engagement of survivors in policy and program, and is it really going to help? While survivors' engagement in policy and programs are critical, it cannot be the only objective of global programs to tackle human trafficking or modern slavery. Similarly, survivors cannot be the only voice. The cause of human trafficking are interlinked with other social factors such as child marriage, domestic violence, family planning. Therefore, it is imperative to scale up awareness programs to address these issues as well. And therefore, the global policies, programs, donor agencies must strengthen other programs on violence against women, which is very critical, child marriage, and livelihood generation programs. All these things are pretty meaningless if we do not have a livelihood generation program at the grassroots level. And survivors must receive extensive training on these issues as well as leadership and management skill if you want to really mitigate human trafficking at some level at the grassroots level. So that's what I wanted to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suti, and that was very interesting. I think you threw to us some very interesting concepts that I would be very interesting to hear some of the survivor leaders and the advocates in our audience, how they react to those findings. And I will now go to Catherine to hear about her fascinating research on voluntary repatriation.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to thank the Orion Policy Institute for the invitation to join this discussion on human trafficking trends and patterns in 2024. And I would like to start by saying I'm by no means an expert on the whole subject of sex trafficking, but I would like to take this opportunity to share with you about the research I've been doing into the viability of voluntary repatriation as an addition or an alternative to rescue. And this is with particular regard to Nepali women who want to exit situations of commercial sexual exploitation in India. So I've been conducting in-country research for the past 2 years in Nepal. but the origins of this study arose during the preceding 5 years, in which I was engaged in community development work within a large red light area in Kolkata, India. And regarding the trends in sex trafficking between Nepal and India, I would say they remain largely unchanged. There are still thousands of girls and women being trafficked into India from Nepal each year. The majority of these women are still from the Tamang ethnic group. The main source villages are still within Nuwakot and Sindhupalchok, which lie to the north of Kathmandu. And the primary destination cities are still Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, with the more recent inclusion of Pune. And the women can still expect to be transferred between these cities at various points in their exploitation journey. And I would say that the trends in anti-trafficking efforts also remain largely unchanged. Raid and rescue is still the primary approach for helping women exit brothels. And secure housing in Nepal is still the primary means of women accessing rehabilitative services. So in short, the trends are the same. There are still Nepali women in brothels. There are still organizations wanting to rescue them, and there are still secure houses to rehabilitate them. But there are other long-standing trends in the region, trends that are seldom heard, but are clearly audible if you spend sufficient time in the red light communities. Many victims do not want to be rescued. Many victims do not want to be placed in secure housing. And many victims do not see themselves as victims. They see themselves as capable adult women, and they are. And the reality is that the majority of victims will never be rescued. And as these unrescued girls and young women mature, they often develop the resilience needed to function in prolonged situations of exploitation. They are strong and independent. They are capable of decision-making. They value autonomy and choice, including choice over if and when they would like to stop sex work, and how they would like to move forward with their lives. And during my time in Kolkata, and since I've been in Nepal, several women have been supported with this voluntary approach to exit, return, and reintegration. And they're doing really well. They're even starting to recommend this type of approach to their sisters and their friends who remain in India as a good way forward. And the research I'm doing now is to provide an evidence base for this type of approach. But it's also to ensure that the voices of women who remain in situations of commercial sexual exploitation are heard by those who have the position and power to influence change. So the Mixed Methods Research Project used semi-structured interviews to collect data from both Nepali women in India and service providers in Nepal. And the aim was to assess the viability of voluntary repatriation and to determine the level to which services in Nepal are able to address the difficulties, the needs, and the priorities of these more autonomous women. And for clarity, I'm not disregarding the value of rescue. I've seen the newly arrived girls and the young women. I've seen the high level of control they are placed under during the first few years. I've heard them talk about their early experiences in the brothel. And rescue is appropriate and probably the only option for exit during these initial years. But there has to be an alternative for the women who've been in Indian brothels for 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So the first questions in the research were to address the primary foundations of viability. Do women want to stop sex work? Do they want to return to Nepal? And are they even free to make these kind of decisions? And the answer to each was yes. 100% of women said they would like to stop sex work if they were free to do so. 89.5% said they would like to come back to Nepal. And yes, many women are free to make these kind of decisions. 63% of the participants were describing how they're already freely traveling back and forth between the two countries. When they're exploring the things that make it difficult to exit and return, no woman saw anything as impossible to overcome. And the reality is they're already doing it. They are already practicing voluntary exit and return. So the research then focused on identifying the actual difficulties, needs, and priorities of the women, and then comparing these to the perceptions held by service providers in Nepal. The accessibility and suitability of the rehabilitative and reintegrative services was also assessed. And while there was a degree of alignment, there were several areas that could be strengthened within service design. And a few examples of this, due to the emphasis on rescue, many services are more suitable for children and young women. And service design really needs to reflect the needs of older autonomous women. For example, many women are the main financial providers for their extended family. And when they come back, they need to prioritize paid employment over education and counseling, the two things that are often top priorities for service providers. And with regard to counseling, there are very few women who wish to engage with trauma counseling on their return. In part, they need to establish safety, stability, and community first. But there are also significant issues in how compatible Western trauma theory is and counseling techniques within the Nepalese context. Women with children may struggle to find housing that will accept them, especially if she has a child who is a teenage boy. There are no alternatives to secure housing, for example, rental support until paid employment is secured. And as a general comment on secure housing, the security, the restrictions on movement, the restrictions on family connection, and the prescribed routines are often denying choice in the name of safety. And there is a really unsettling similarity in the way that women are describing their experiences in secure NGO housing with how they describe their early experiences in the brothel. There are also some broader recommendations, such as repatriation policy really needs to acknowledge that there's two pathways out of commercial sexual exploitation: rescue and voluntary exit. Victim guidelines, victim identification guidelines need to recognize the existence of the non-rescued victim or the individual who does not wish to identify as a victim, but has been affected in exactly the same way and should have the same access to rehabilitative support and funding. Service provision needs to be person-centric rather than housing-centric. So any person who has experienced commercial sexual exploitation should be able to access help, not just those that live in NGO shelter homes. There needs to be increased collaboration between service providers in Nepal to ensure that women receive the best care for their unique set of circumstances. It's unlikely that one service provider will meet the needs of every person, or even meet all the needs of just one person. And then on the collaboration front, it would be better if service providers in Nepal and India were also collaborating. This would enable the capacity building opportunities to be matched in both countries. There would be a consistency which would allow women to streamline their reintegration process. It would also ensure that women in India know that they have options in Nepal. I visited Pune recently and spoke with a group of Nepali women, and they had no idea that there were any options for them in Nepal. And one woman asked me if she was too old to receive help, as she'd seen the number of organizations focusing on children and young women. She was 40, she's younger than me, and she believes that she is too old for a different future. So in finishing, what my main hopes are for the trends in 2024, firstly, that our perception of sex trafficking victims and survivors would expand to include the large number of women who have never been or unlikely to be rescued, who are now mature women whose difficulties and needs are different from, but equally valid to those of a child or young woman. And secondly, that this shift in perception would lead to inclusive policies and service design that will facilitate the dignified repatriation and reintegration of all those who have experienced sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. So thank you very much. Those are my views coming from the research and my time in India and Nepal. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. It's not our first webinar together, and it's always such a great pleasure to hear about your research in Nepal and India. So I remind now the members of the audience that we still have a few minutes left. So if you have any question or comment, there is someone that you would like to pick up on, please feel most welcome to do so in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. In the meantime, I see that Awa Francisca, who is from Survivors Network Cameroon, wrote a question for George. She's saying that a lot of what you're describing, George, in terms of the trafficking compounds is happening in Cameroon as well, but that they don't have capability or resources to include this in their organization's activities. So she's asking about what opportunities either for partnering with the HRC or in general, what organizations that don't have the resources can do to address this very complex problem in their own regions.
Yeah, hi, Awa. Yeah, great question. And yeah, thank you. Thank you for saying we're doing a good job. We're trying. I did not know that this was happening in Cameroon. Maybe we can speak more about this after, because are you saying that there's trafficking victims from Cameroon, or that there's the compounds in Cameroon? But either way, yeah, the lack of capabilities or resources is a problem for many survivor network organizations, as the fellow panelists have discussed. But it's something that can be built on. HRC has worked with an organization in Bangladesh called Anirban, and despite having very limited resources, they've managed to do some pretty incredible work. So I can speak to you more about that later. But yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, George, for picking on this. And if anyone else has any question before we close the webinar, please feel free to do so. If not, I will ask our panelists to give a conclusive remark to end the panel. It could be a wrap-up summary of what you said, or could be picking up something that another panelist contributed to the discussion. So I think if I can take advantage of my position of moderator to kick off, I think something that I found very interesting that came up in some of your interventions, and that I see working as freed slaves in my day-to-day job, is the role that technologies are playing in the human trafficking landscape. I think it's very worrying, but I think it's also interesting to see how it is not something limited to a specific geography. It is something that we see in many countries, in many regions across the world. So I think it will be interesting to see how we will be able to learn one from the other, learn across organizations, learn across country, learn across regions, to equip ourselves with better tools to deal with this challenge. So I think looking at 2024, I hope that we will be able to use the technology tools to learn from each other and fight human trafficking more effectively.
Yeah, Marta, I think that's great. And I think something that I think everyone's spoken about today is the importance of survivor networks, survivor organizations, and just following on from the role of technology, that's something that survivor organizations can also utilize, connecting with each other. You know, organization in Nigeria may be able to learn from what an organization in Nepal does. And today with social media, like this is an opportunity, this is an option that wasn't available before. So like in my presentation, I went through how traffickers in the scam compounds have they used technology. Now we're in an opportunity, a position to use this technology for something good. So I think, and the movement is there.
Thank you, George. Suti, Catherine, Shilem, would you like to give a final comment before we conclude our panel? Yes, Suti.
Yeah, just kind of echoing what you and George just mentioned, in my experience over the last 1 year, almost all the survivors that I have met were actually, they became victim through social media, then that's something, even in areas which are actually very, very poor, very, very remote parts of the world, because the Facebook kind of works, and even if they're not educated, they can obviously hear and see. So social media is one big medium of how people are getting trafficked, but one of the ways of engaging survivors would be they know the process. They have been through this process, and it's important that the survivors in respective regions, in their own language, come up with a kind of a framework or kind of some guidelines to help other people in the region, really. And I think the technology companies themselves can help. One of the challenges is that the frontline organizations, most of the people who are working on the front line, they do out of passion, to be honest, and they're not really, they don't have university degrees or something like that. So they really do not know how to use sophisticated technology, or, they're fighting organized crime with very little resources. But one of the ways how survivors can digitally empower others is to share their experience, or at least the touch points, because obviously the way human trafficking, the traffickers work is that they use certain kind of language in respective areas. And it's important to make people aware about what kind of tools and tactics they generally use. And that's what I'm looking at this year, is to encourage more survivors to create guidelines in their own local languages in own respective areas, and highlight those so that it can be used as a prevention tool. Thank you.
Thank you, Suti. And I see that we have a question that perhaps Shillian, you want to pick up. Swati is asking, in addition to supporting survivors and increasing awareness, as we have been highlighting in the webinar, what actions do you believe that governments and international organizations should be taking to improve deterrence?
Is it for me?
I think perhaps Shillian wants to pick up on that, since she had already her hand. Maybe she wants to include her comments. Shillian, thank you.
Hi. What I want to talk about briefly is I believe that the way traffickers operate is the way we also need to start operating. I mean, traffickers have collaboration. They work together. They team up to fight, to build their networks, to get their victims. They work together. You even from the definition of trafficking, you see that there is a system of working together. And then for us, as people in the anti-trafficking sector, whichever part you're playing, we need to work together. I see a lot of divide, and that's not encouraging for survival leaders. There is a need for us to work the way they are working. They get information from what we are doing. Honestly, as a survivor, I've seen them get information from the work we do, and then develop approach on how to counter what we're already doing. And so it's also okay, it's also good for us to come together. I really feel there is a need for this to happen, for trafficking to reduce in 2024. If we really want to approach trafficking and reduce it, there is a need for strong collaboration or strong collaborative efforts, both in the government sector, between businesses, and also among survival leaders. I think there is a need for such collaboration. That's basically what.
Thank you, Shillian. Catherine, would you like to have the last word?
No pressure. Yeah, just listening to what everybody's saying. And there are some consistencies in between the regions. There are some things that are different. And I think from what I've learned is we can't be static, whether it's how you perceive who a victim is, who a survivor is, who a trafficker is. it's not static. If you stay in one way of thinking, you will never keep up with it. You will never make an impact. And some of that is going to be about hearing the different voices. So the actual voices of people affected and all of the people affected, not as like with my research, not just the young ones who are rescued, but the vast majority who are left behind. Or as other people mentioned, who are the pimps in sex trafficking? What's their story? What is the story of the trafficker? What is going on here? And I think we need to be willing to have an openness to learn and rethink our approaches and base things more on a learned reality, whether that's through research rather than basing things on assumptions. So yeah, that's what I would conclude with.
Thank you. I think that's great. And in the meantime, I see a very last question from Stephen that perhaps George, you're the person to take this. He's asking about advancements in technology and how they can be leveraged to combat human trafficking, and how can individuals, so not only organizations and governments, contribute to support these technology-based initiatives.
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. I tried to touch upon that in my presentation, and I guess from there, in addition to kind of open source investigations, and in addition to my form of human trafficking, that I spoke on, the other forms of human trafficking, recruitment was used in social media. So this analyzing social media trends is definitely something that the government should utilize going forward, but also satellite mapping, looking at, in the case of the compounds, where these compounds are operating, because a lot of them we don't know where they are, and utilizing satellite imagery is one way that technology can be used to enhance our knowledge of the crime. I think that's the key point as well, is a lot of these things will, nothing will really work in isolation, but through using different techniques, methodologies, we can come to like a greater understanding of these crimes and how they work, and that will allow us to better combat them. But yeah, I'd love to speak to you more about that, and especially the role of technology going forward in 2024 and even beyond. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, George. So with this, we are concluding this webinar. Thank you once again, George, Shilian, Suti, and Catherine, for sharing your knowledge with us today. This was a very insightful webinar, and I'm sure that everyone is going to leave this session enriched by the conversation that we had. I thank the members of the audience for being with us today and for their questions and comments. And of course, I thank Orion Policy Institute for organizing and hosting this timely webinar. Finally, kindly note that the recording of this webinar will be available on OPI's website, which is orionpolicy.org. And on OPI's website, you can also find all the Institute's analysis and research pieces on different human rights related topics, including human trafficking. I thank you once again for being with us today, and I wish you a great continuation of your day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.